Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Basements were never meant to be welcoming. They're cold, quiet, and too far from anyone who might hear you scream. Some doors should never be opened. And some things down there have never seen the light. And if you hear footsteps coming up from below, you might already be too late. Back in 2013, during a time in my life that I now realize was already shadowed by isolation and the quiet aftermath of personal loss, I had moved into a modest red brick townhouse on the south side of Chicago, a narrow, two-story structure nestled in a block of similar buildings that all bore the weary, aging marks of forgotten renovations, peeling trim, and overgrown alleyways, where everything seemed still and subdued, as if the whole street had exhaled years ago and never breathed in again. I'd come to that place after the end of a long and difficult relationship. And though it was never intended to be permanent, I had told myself that a period of solitude would do me good, that the silence and space would help me recover my sense of self and clarity, far away from anyone else's expectations or noise. The house, though far from beautiful, had a kind of quiet dignity about it. Tall, narrow windows, creaky wooden floors, and a small, unfinished basement that I used more for storing boxes than anything else, since it was perpetually cold and smelled faintly of rust, concrete dust, and something older that had settled into the bones of the place long before I arrived. At the far end of that basement was a crawl space, partially concealed behind uneven drywall that had clearly been patched over in a hurry by someone who cared more about appearances than structure. The drywall was slightly bowed in places, smudged with water stains and discoloration that the previous owner had tried to paint over. And though I didn't give it much thought at the time, I now realize that discomfort often presents itself first as dismissal. We ignore what we don't want to see. The first time I heard the noise, it was deep into the night, sometime around 2 a.m, when the entire neighborhood felt suffocated by silence and the kind of darkness that seems to fold in on itself. I had woken suddenly, not because of a specific sound or movement, but with that vague, uneasy awareness that something was different. Something was just slightly off. And as I lay there in bed beneath the soft glow of the hallway light, I began to hear the faintest rhythmic noise rising through the floorboards beneath me. It wasn't dramatic or sharp at first. It sounded like the dragging of a coarse material across wood or plaster. A kind of deliberate scraping that came in slow, uneven intervals. Just long enough apart that I kept trying to convince myself it had stopped, only for it to start again just as I had nearly relaxed. I told myself it was nothing, perhaps the house expanding in the cold or the wind curling under the siding. But something about the timing and repetition of it began to gnaw at my mind in a way I couldn't quite articulate, as if my subconscious already knew what I refused to admit. The sound returned again the next night, and the one after that, always beginning sometime shortly after 2 a.m., and lasting only long enough to make me question whether I was imagining it, or worse, losing sleep to some irrational fear brought on by the loneliness that had begun to press in on me since moving in. I tried to ignore it. I kept myself busy during the day and exhausted at night. But as the pattern continued, I found myself unable to shake the growing awareness that the sound was not random or mechanical. It was patterned, intentional, and somehow deeply human in its pacing and restraint. Eventually, I called a pest control company, hoping they would tell me there was some simple explanation, that a family of rats had burrowed into the walls, or that raccoons had managed to access the crawl space through a gap in the foundation. The man who arrived was polite and thorough, inspecting every corner of the house, from the attic to the vents, from behind the appliances to the deepest part of the basement where I'd once stored moving boxes I'd never bothered to open again. He set traps, examined insulation, checked for droppings and nesting material, and even poked his flashlight through a small gap near the crawl space. But when he finally stood back up and wiped his hands on his jeans, he told me, with the casual tone of someone who'd said it 1,000 times, that he hadn't found any sign of an infestation or anything else that might explain what I'd been hearing during the night. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to accept that old houses make strange noises and that maybe I was just being dramatic, worn thin by sleeplessness and the emotional aftermath of the life I had left behind. But the sounds didn't stop. If anything, they became bolder, not necessarily louder, but closer, more certain in their timing and persistence, and more disturbingly, they seemed to migrate. One night, I could hear the noise behind the living room wall, low and steady, as if someone, or something, was testing the drywall from the inside. And another night, it seemed to echo from beneath the stairwell leading down to the basement, where no pipes or ductwork ran at all. As the days passed, I began to notice subtler things that I couldn't explain away so easily. Papers on my desk slightly out of place, a kitchen cabinet door left half open that I was sure I had closed, the unmistakable sensation that I was being observed, not through windows or cameras, but from within the very structure of the house itself, as though something unseen was buried just beneath the surface of the drywall. Watching and waiting with silent, practiced patience. On the night everything changed, I had been lying in bed, wide awake and anxious, already anticipating the familiar scratching noise, when it began once again. This time louder, steadier, almost taunting in its clarity. Driven more by exhaustion and a need for answers than by courage, I got out of bed, crept down the wooden stairs, and walked across the cold basement floor barefoot, wrapped in a sweater and clutching a flashlight with trembling fingers, the bulb casting long, quivering shadows along the cracked concrete walls. The sound stopped abruptly as I approached the far end of the basement, replaced by a thick silence that felt heavy and unnatural, like the space itself was holding its breath. I stood before the drywall, inches from the discolored surface, and after a moment of hesitation, I leaned forward slowly and pressed the side of my face against it, listening with all the focus I could muster through the pounding of my own pulse in my ears. What I heard was not the sound of movement, not the rustling of an animal or the groan of settling pipes. It was breathing. Faint, human breathing, shallow and slow, steady in rhythm, unmistakable in its closeness. Whoever was on the other side of that wall was not moving. They were just breathing, as if they were aware of my presence and waiting to see what I would do next, as if this was a ritual they had rehearsed many times before. I recoiled, heart hammering, and stumbled backward up the stairs, barely registering the cold on my skin or the creaking of the steps beneath me. I locked the basement door behind me with shaking hands, grabbed my phone, and called the police, my voice calm on the surface, but trembling beneath as I tried to explain that there was someone inside my house. Not outside, not breaking in, but already inside, possibly within the very walls themselves. 2 officers arrived within minutes, both professional and visibly skeptical. Though they took my concerns seriously enough to begin examining the basement. Flashlights sweeping across the walls until one of them paused near the rightmost edge of the drywall and crouched down. There, almost imperceptible, unless you knew where to look, was a seam. An uneven gap running along the edge of the wall where the panel had not been properly secured. With some effort, they pried it loose, and what they uncovered behind it has haunted me ever since. Behind the drywall was a narrow cavity, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, stretching several feet along the length of the foundation. And inside that narrow recess was the unmistakable evidence that someone had been living there for quite some time. A thin, stained mattress was laid directly on the concrete, with a folded fleece blanket atop it, surrounded by crumpled food wrappers, an empty water bottle, a flashlight with working batteries, and a stack of old canned goods tucked carefully into the corner, like someone had made a deliberate effort to create a sustainable, hidden space. Even more horrifying was what lay beyond that. The discovery of a rusted vertical maintenance hatch near the back wall of the crawl space, which opened out into the alley behind my townhouse, concealed behind a warped metal panel that blended almost perfectly with the structure's exterior. There was no lock, only a latch and some insulation stuffed loosely around the frame to keep out the cold. Whoever had been using it had easy, silent access into and out of the house. The man was never found. There were no fingerprints, no signs of a forced entry anywhere, no trail to follow, and no way to tell how long he had been hiding in that crawl space, or how many nights he had watched me from just a few feet away. The police filed a report, and I was told to install locks, change the alarm codes, and consider finding somewhere else to stay until everything could be properly secured. I didn't wait. I packed what I could into boxes, moved out by the end of that week, and never went back to that house again, not even to say goodbye to it. Several weeks later, while preparing my laptop for a resale, I opened the router logs as part of a routine system reset. And what I found there shattered any illusion that I'd ever been alone in that house. Logged across multiple nights, all around the same time between 2 and 3 a.m., were instances of a foreign device connecting to my home network. Brief, almost surgically precise connections that never lasted longer than 15 to 20 minutes at a time. The device name was not a random string of numbers, nor a default label. It was my full name, typed out clearly, first, middle, and last, exactly as it appeared on the lease agreement that I had kept in a drawer beside my desk, along with old tax documents, utility bills, and other personal records that I had never thought to secure. Whoever had been living in my crawl space had not only accessed the physical space of my home, but had also invaded the invisible, intimate structure of my life. Learning my routines, reading my documents, connecting to my Wi-Fi, and leaving behind a digital fingerprint that felt far more violating than any broken lock or open window. He had been watching, he had been listening, and for reasons I still cannot understand, he had chosen not to act, at least not in the ways I had feared, preferring instead to remain close, patient, and completely hidden, like a shadow that never needed to move in order to be terrifying. And I still wonder, even now, whether he left because I found him, or because he no longer needed to stay. We had purchased the house in Des Moines during the early part of 2007, right as the last traces of winter had begun to recede, and the thaw laid bare the quiet, unmoving stillness of the neighborhood that hadn't seen much change since the late 1970s. It was one of those modest Midwestern streets with cracked sidewalks, aged maple trees growing too close to the curb, and power lines that sagged slightly with the weight of time and neglect. But the quiet felt comfortable then, almost inviting, as if it belonged to a simpler version of the world that had faded without protest. The house itself was a brick two-story structure, likely built sometime in the late 40s. And though the floors creaked underfoot and the walls bore signs of long-settled dust and sunlight damage, it stood on a solid foundation. And that gave us the confidence to see it as a long-term project, something we could work on together, slowly, lovingly, with care. Melissa and I had been searching for that kind of place for months, something we could afford to renovate ourselves without worrying about the burden of modern layouts or updated appliances. And when we walked through that house for the first time, despite the faded wallpaper and rust-colored carpet, it felt to both of us like something we could build into a home. The property had been vacant for several years before we arrived, having sat untouched after the death of its previous owner. A man we were told had passed away in a local nursing facility, with no surviving relatives or heirs. Because of the lack of legal contest and the house's outdated condition, the bank had listed it below market value, and we saw it as an opportunity, something waiting for life to be brought back into it. During the second week of renovations, I had gone down into the basement in order to check on the furnace, which had developed the annoying habit of going out every couple of days despite our attempts to relight it or adjust the pilot valve. The basement was unfinished and had likely never been intended for anything more than storage, as evidenced by the exposed concrete walls, steel support beams, and a single low-wattage bulb that hung from a frayed pull string overhead, casting just enough light to move through, but not enough to see clearly into every corner. I had been down there before, mostly just to clear out debris and remove old shelving that had rusted through at the joints. But that particular day, as I turned back toward the stairs, I noticed something about the far wall that seemed subtly, almost imperceptibly wrong. At first glance, it might have looked ordinary to anyone who hadn't already memorized the lines of the foundation, but I realized, as I stepped closer, that the section of drywall at the back of the basement didn't quite match the rest of the room in texture or color. It appeared newer, smoother, more evenly painted, lacking the faint yellowing or spider-cracked finish that the surrounding walls displayed. And when I knocked lightly with the back of my hand, the hollow sound that echoed back did not resemble the solid, concrete-backed thud I would have expected from a true foundation wall. It wasn't alarming at first, just peculiar, but peculiar things in old houses often beg to be understood. And I told myself it was probably covering up a plumbing fixture or an access panel that had been sealed off for convenience. I didn't immediately sense anything wrong, only curiosity. And after retrieving a crowbar and hammer from the garage, I returned and began to carefully pull apart the drywall section by section, watching as the seams crumbled faster than I expected, as though they had been built to remain hidden, but not necessarily to withstand discovery. As the last of the board gave way, the space behind it revealed itself not as an access panel or utility recess, but as a small, narrow, windowless room that appeared to have been constructed deliberately, almost surgically, as though its builder had measured every inch of it to fit within the void left behind the basement wall. The room could not have been more than 6 feet wide and perhaps 10 feet deep, barely large enough to stand inside without feeling like you were invading something intimate and not meant to be touched. There were no light fixtures inside, no ventilation ducts, and no door from any other angle. It could only be entered through the hole I had just created. The air that drifted out into the basement as I stood at the threshold was stale in a way that made me instinctively stop breathing for a moment. And it carried with it the dense, earthy smell of rot, mildew, and something faintly sweet that I didn't recognize, but that I never quite forgot. Lying in the center of the room was an old mattress, a thin, twin-size thing with no sheet or blanket, sagging in the middle and pushed flush against the rear wall. And scattered across the concrete floor around it were what appeared to be dozens of Polaroid photographs, curled at the edges from moisture and time. Their colors faded, but still legible in the flashlight beam I held loosely in my hand. I stepped forward, more out of a sense of instinct than decision. And as my boot crunched lightly on the edge of one of the photographs, I knelt to pick it up, turning it over and holding it close to the light. The image showed a young boy, perhaps 10 or 11, sitting cross-legged on the very mattress that lay in front of me now. His back straight, his hands folded in his lap, and his face turned directly toward the camera in an expression that was neither joyful nor overtly afraid, but rather suspended in something much harder to define, something close to defeat, or a kind of frozen alertness, as though he had been asked to remain perfectly still without knowing when he would be allowed to move again. I picked up another photograph and found it showed a different child, a girl this time, seated in the exact same position on the same mattress. Her posture mirrored nearly perfectly, her eyes wide and unmoving, her expression eerily similar in its subdued tension. As I turned my attention around the room, I realized that all the images followed the same pattern. Dozens of children, each positioned identically, always on that same mattress, always facing the camera directly, always silent and unmoving, and yet never crying or displaying open terror. There was something far worse in that. Something methodical and restrained and chilling in a way I could not describe at the time, and still struggle to describe now. In the far corner of the room, mounted onto a corroded metal tripod, sat an old Polaroid camera with part of its casing melted and warped, as though it had been exposed to heat or deliberately damaged in some past moment of panic or neglect. Beside it, partially concealed under the remains of a rotted wooden shelf, was a rusted steel lockbox that I pried open using the edge of the crowbar. Inside were children's shoes, rows of them, some faded and scuffed with heavy use, others nearly pristine, all sorted neatly by size, and each pair marked with strips of aged masking tape bearing handwritten numbers and, in some cases, a single letter, but never a name. There was no context offered, no accompanying documents, nothing that could explain what I was seeing in terms that made it feel any less horrifying. Melissa had followed me down at some point, likely after realizing I'd been gone longer than expected. But the moment she stepped into the basement and saw me kneeling in that ruined doorway, surrounded by photographs and dust, I heard her retreat, her footsteps turning sharply and disappearing back up the stairs without a single word spoken. She never entered that room, not once, and I never asked her to, because I knew that the longer I remained there, the more impossible it became to explain or understand or reduce to anything less than what it clearly was. That evening, we contacted the police. We told them everything, what we had found, where it had been hidden, what condition it was in. And by the next morning, the house was surrounded by official vehicles, with officers in plain clothing moving in and out of the property for the better part of 2 weeks as they cataloged the contents of the hidden room and documented every detail with the kind of professional detachment that only made it feel more surreal. From what we were later told, several of the children depicted in the photographs were eventually identified as long-term runaways or wards of the state who had disappeared from shelters or foster care systems across the Midwest during the 1980s and early 1990s. Their cases having long gone cold due to lack of evidence or public attention, while others, perhaps half, were never matched to any official records at all. The man who had previously owned the house had died 3 years earlier in a nursing home just outside the city, and he had no surviving family members or legal guardianship over any minors, nor did he have any documented history of criminal activity, arrests, or suspicion of wrongdoing. There were no fingerprints in the room beyond our own, no signs of recent entry, no receipts, and no identifying marks that could be used to tie anyone definitively to what had happened there. In the end, despite the efforts made, no charges were ever filed, and the case was closed quietly under a lack of prosecutable evidence. Even as rumors and unease continued to linger among those who had witnessed the contents firsthand, we sold the house shortly afterward, disclosing only the legal minimum required by real estate law, and we never returned. The basement remained sealed from the moment the investigation ended, and the next owners, from what we later heard through a mutual contact, chose to have the entire lower floor walled off and converted into storage, refusing to use it in any capacity. I have never spoken publicly about what we found, not because I was told not to, but because I still do not know what good could come from telling it. I think about the photographs more often than I'd like to admit. I remember their faces, not crying, not screaming, just sitting still in that dim light, their eyes fixed on something behind the lens, as though waiting for whatever came next, already knowing no one was coming. In the winter of 1992, I was a 20-year-old university student sharing a weathered rental house in Sydney's inner west with 2 other students, Rachel, who was studying environmental science, and Marcus, who was pursuing a degree in architecture. And while the house was far from glamorous, it had just enough space, just enough privacy, and just enough structural integrity to convince us we could make it work for the academic year. The building itself was an aging Federation-style structure set on a narrow lot, tucked behind a patchy front lawn and partially concealed by the drooping branches of an overgrown jacaranda tree. And although the facade had clearly not been repainted in decades, and the roof tiles clicked and shifted with every strong gust of wind, we had accepted its flaws as part of the charm that came with renting on a student budget. There was nothing particularly unusual about the house at first glance. It had 3 modest bedrooms, a cramped kitchen that opened into a low-ceilinged living room, and a basement accessible through a thin wooden door just off the hallway, where the floorboards had worn smooth from decades of foot traffic. That basement, which we used mostly for storing boxes, unused furniture, and supplies we didn't have space for upstairs, was always a degree or 2 colder than the rest of the house, regardless of the weather. And although we all commented on how damp and musty it felt down there, none of us paid it much attention beyond the occasional trip to retrieve something from storage. It wasn't until the small irregularities began to accumulate, so gradually that we almost failed to notice them, that the house began to take on a different weight in my mind. As though something beneath the surface was beginning to press upward, waiting for us to acknowledge it. I remember the first time I suspected something was off. I had packed away some leftover curry into a container, placed it on the middle shelf of the refrigerator with my initials marked clearly on the lid, and returned the next evening to find the container still there, but noticeably lighter, as though someone had carefully removed half the contents without disturbing the placement. At the time, I asked Marcus, more out of curiosity than accusation, whether he had helped himself to it. And when he denied it, and Rachel too swore she hadn't touched it, I assumed I must have simply misremembered how much I'd left behind. But then, similar things started happening more often. Small but specific incidents that left no real explanation. Food would go missing from the pantry, not all at once, but in subtle increments that only became suspicious when we compared notes and realized we were all experiencing it. A nearly full loaf of bread would appear with 3 slices gone, even when no one claimed to have used it. Cereal boxes would be lighter than they had been the day before. More than once, I found the milk bottle replaced in the fridge with the cap resting loosely, as if someone had handled it in a hurry. These were small things, too minor to call the police over, too vague to confront one another about seriously. But they planted the first seeds of unease. Then there were the misplaced items, which began to stand out more clearly as the weeks passed. My set of keys, which I had left on the kitchen counter one evening, was found sitting 3 steps up on the staircase the next morning. A hardcover textbook I had left on my desk appeared beside my bed the next day. A pair of sneakers I distinctly remembered placing in the hall closet were suddenly resting just outside the back door. I asked Rachel about it in passing, and she said she'd noticed a few strange things too, though she didn't offer much detail. And when I mentioned it to Marcus, he just shrugged and said the house was probably playing tricks on us, that it was easy to forget things when we were all so busy and sleep-deprived. It wasn't until I started hearing the footsteps that I truly began to feel unsettled. They didn't sound like the pops and creaks of old floorboards adjusting to temperature or settling into place. These were soft, rhythmic, deliberate. Light footfalls moving beneath the floor late at night, too slow and too intentional to be rats or possums. I would lie in bed, perfectly still, staring at the ceiling while listening to the gentle pressure of steps pacing across the house. And I would try to convince myself that what I was hearing was the sound of water in the pipes or the creaking of wood. But the pattern was always the same. 3 or 4 slow steps, then silence, then another series of steps in a different direction. And every time I strained to listen more carefully, the noise would stop, as though whoever or whatever was making it had become aware of my awareness. It was early one Sunday morning when I finally went down to the basement with a specific purpose in mind. The weather had turned and the nights had grown cold enough to justify digging out the thick blanket I had stored in one of the boxes months earlier. The air in the basement was colder than usual, and as I descended the stairs, I could smell the familiar mix of concrete dust, mold, and something metallic that had always lingered faintly down there. I walked toward the back of the room, scanning the labeled boxes in search of the one marked winter clothes, when I noticed something about the tall wooden bookshelf that stood against the far wall. It had always been there, or at least I believed it had. But for the first time, I saw that it wasn't sitting flush with the concrete behind it. The bottom edge tilted slightly away from the wall, leaving a thin, uneven shadow beneath it. Curious, I stepped forward and gave the edge of the bookshelf a tentative push, surprised by how easily it slid along the concrete floor. As I moved it aside, a portion of the wall was revealed, specifically a square wooden panel built directly into the foundation, stained dark with age and moisture, and completely unmarked by paint, knobs, or hinges. I reached out and pressed against the panel, which creaked inward under my hand, revealing a narrow opening that exhaled a rush of cold, stagnant air that smelled like damp fabric and something deeper, more organic, and quietly sour. Inside was a crawl space, low, tight, and walled with unfinished concrete. The ceiling was barely 5 feet high, forcing me to crouch as I stepped inside. The space extended no more than 6 feet in either direction. And in that dim, constricted chamber, I saw a rough sleeping area fashioned from several layers of blankets that had long since absorbed the moisture and dust of the place. There was a cluster of rusted food cans in the corner, mostly tuna, beans, and spaghetti, all opened with a manual key and half-consumed, a flickering lantern with a broken switch, and an overturned milk crate that had been repurposed as a table. Resting on that crate, perfectly centered, was a small leather-bound notebook. Its cover had curled with humidity, and when I picked it up, I noticed how the pages clung together as I turned them. Each one filled edge to edge with cramped handwriting that shifted from neat to erratic over time. The entries were dated across several months, and each one appeared to document details about our routines inside the house. There were observations like, "Marcus home by 5:30, or "Girl eats alone tonight," and others that tracked our movements with disturbing precision. "Lights off at 11:42, and "She left window open again." The handwriting grew more obsessive as the pages progressed. One entry described my morning routine in detail, noting what time I usually entered the shower and how long I spent brushing my teeth. Another noted how often Rachel left her laundry basket by the stairs. Then I found a page toward the back of the notebook, written in slightly larger lettering that read, "She hums when she cooks. Same song every time, off key." On the following page, circled twice in blue ink, was a single entry that said, "She sleeps with the window open again. Easy." I don't know how long I stood there with the notebook in my hand, heart pounding in my chest, before I backed out of the crawl space, knees shaking, and hurried up the basement stairs, slamming the door shut behind me with a force I didn't realize I was capable of. We called the police that same day. They arrived within the hour, and after an initial walkthrough of the crawl space, they called in additional units and a forensic team. The officers explained that the space had likely been accessed through a sealed-off sewer line connected to a now-defunct stormwater system that ran beneath a row of properties on our street, and that someone had been using it to come and go undetected. They found discarded clothing, food wrappers, and hair samples, along with fingerprints on the lantern and inside the notebook. But after processing everything, they told us there were no matches in any national database. Whoever had been living there, watching us, documenting our lives in excruciating detail, had no record, no identity they could link him to, and no known location. They believed he had fled the area sometime between my discovery and the arrival of the police, possibly retreating through the tunnel and disappearing into the city's older sewer infrastructure. We left the house 3 days later. None of us had the nerve to stay another night. I packed only what I could carry, abandoning half my belongings in that room without a second thought. I never returned. I never even asked what became of the property. The landlord, I heard through a friend, sealed off the basement entirely and stopped renting the place out within a year. Even now, decades later, I still find myself checking beneath beds, inside closets, and behind doors in every place I've lived since. I don't sleep with my windows open anymore, even in the hottest months of summer. Sometimes I hear a sound, an ordinary creak, a faint thud, a shift in the floorboards. And for one terrible moment, I find myself holding my breath, listening for footsteps where there should be none. Because knowing that someone was down there, for all those months, just a few feet below where I slept, isn't something I've ever really forgotten, and I doubt I ever will. We moved into the house during the early months of 1995, just as the gray skies over Portland began to shift into that strange blend of late spring chill and hesitant warmth that Oregon never quite commits to. The property had been listed as a foreclosure, a good deal on paper. And though the house carried a certain wear and tear you'd expect from a place that had sat empty for some time, it felt stable enough to us. 2 stories, 3 bedrooms, a fenced-in backyard where the kids could play, and a basement that I told myself I'd eventually turn into a workspace or storage area once things settled down. It wasn't a dream home by any means, but it felt like a fresh beginning for our family. My wife, our 2 children, and myself, trying to root ourselves into something quiet and steady after too many months of uncertainty. The basement, however, gave me pause from the beginning, not because of anything overtly sinister, but because of how strangely lifeless it felt, as if the air down there had been sealed off from the rest of the world for far longer than the listing had suggested. It was unfinished. Plain concrete floors, no drywall, with wooden support beams visible and wrapped in cobwebs, and a single hanging light bulb at the center that flickered faintly every time you pulled the chain to turn it on. There were remnants of someone else's life in that room. A few broken boards, a rusted paint can, and in one far corner, pushed against the wall almost like it had been forgotten or intentionally ignored, stood a large wooden dresser. It was old, dark-stained, with warped drawers and metal handles that had long since begun to rust. It looked heavy, hand-built, and out of place, as if it had been absorbed into the house itself, rather than moved in or left behind. We were too consumed with the chaos of unpacking boxes and adjusting to new routines to concern ourselves with the furniture buried in the basement. The kids were adjusting to their new school. My wife was making the house feel like home 1 room at a time. And I was commuting early and coming back late, just trying to hold everything together. For a while, the basement remained untouched. A place for boxes and off-season decorations. Not a space we felt any reason to occupy more than absolutely necessary. It was around the 3rd or 4th week after moving in that I began to notice something small, strange, and easy to dismiss at first. Each time I went down into the basement to grab something or rearrange a few boxes, that dresser seemed to be in a slightly different position than it had been before, just barely askew from the wall. Maybe an inch or 2 forward, the sort of subtle shift you could easily explain away as faulty memory or the result of kids playing where they shouldn't. I mentioned it to my wife once, offhandedly, while we were brushing our teeth. But she simply shook her head and told me she hadn't touched it. And neither had the kids, and that maybe I just bumped it myself without realizing. But as more time passed, the movement became more obvious, and the excuses I was giving myself began to feel thinner, like I was participating in some quiet denial of something that I didn't quite articulate yet. I would push the dresser back flush against the wall, then return 2 or 3 days later to find it noticeably out of alignment again. Just enough to catch my eye and twist something in my stomach that I couldn't explain. Still, I didn't press it. I was tired. We were all adjusting, and the last thing I wanted to do was stir anxiety into a home that was supposed to offer us stability and peace. One morning, after seeing the kids off to school and hearing my wife upstairs folding laundry, I decided to finally deal with the damn dresser once and for all. I figured I'd drag it to the garage, maybe break it down later for firewood, or just leave it out for trash collection. As I descended the basement stairs, I could already feel something about that morning was different. Though I couldn't yet name it, just an uneasiness that sat deep in my chest, like I was intruding on something I wasn't supposed to see. When I opened the top drawer, expecting maybe cobwebs or a few old nails, what I found instead made my entire body tense, as if the room had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. There, nestled inside the drawer, was my daughter's pink plastic hairbrush, still tangled with strands of her hair, lying beside a familiar child-sized toothbrush that belonged in the upstairs bathroom. Beneath them, carefully laid out and clearly not scattered by accident, was a small stack of Polaroid photographs, the kind that develop in your hand moments after they're taken. I picked them up with trembling fingers and slowly flipped through them, each one worse than the last. Grainy images of our home taken from outside, some from across the street, others much closer, peering through windows. One showed my son playing in the backyard. Another caught my wife at the sink, washing dishes, completely unaware. One was of me standing on the porch, staring into the distance. Every photo was a violation, silent proof that someone had been watching us, studying us, not from a distance, but from close enough to memorize the rhythm of our lives. I pulled open the second drawer with a growing sense of dread and found even more personal items. A tube of my wife's lipstick, my son's missing baseball cap, a set of keys I'd assumed I'd misplaced weeks ago. There were more photographs too, some so close to the windows it was obvious the photographer had stood just feet from where we slept, ate, and lived, completely unaware of being observed. I don't remember deciding to move the dresser. I just remember doing it. Hands clumsily gripping the edges as I dragged the heavy thing away from the wall with far more urgency than I'd originally intended. And that's when I saw it. The back panel of the dresser had been carefully cut out, not broken or rotted, but surgically removed in a near-perfect square, as if someone had used it to create a hidden passage. Behind it, in the concrete wall itself, was a rough, hand-dug hole, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The edges were jagged. Gray dust littered the floor, and a cold current of air drifted from the darkness beyond. I stood there, blinking into that void, holding my breath, unable to process how something so deliberate, so grotesquely human, had existed just a few feet behind, where we stored our holiday decorations and unopened boxes. With a flashlight in one hand and fear pulsing in my throat, I leaned forward and peered into the space. Inside was a narrow chamber carved crudely into the foundation, barely tall enough to sit up in, lined with flattened cardboard boxes and a pair of filthy blankets arranged like bedding. Scattered around the space were several empty water bottles, torn food wrappers, and in the far corner, sitting atop a dented metal lunchbox, was a thick, spiral-bound journal. The whole place stank of sweat, mold, and long unwashed clothing. And yet what disturbed me more than the living conditions was the unmistakable reality that someone had, for weeks or possibly months, been hiding inside our home. We called the police immediately. I didn't even bother to read the journal. I couldn't. The weight of it in my hands was enough to tell me that whatever was written inside had been obsessively recorded, every page filled with a stranger's perspective of our lives. When the officers arrived, they took over the space quickly, sealing off the basement and examining every inch. One of them flipped through the journal in front of me and began reading aloud in short clinical fragments. And what I heard still makes my skin crawl. It was a log, meticulously written and detailed, of our family's daily movements, times we woke up, times we went to bed, when the children left for school, when my wife went grocery shopping, which nights we forgot to lock the side door, which windows we left cracked for air. There were notes about what television shows the kids watched, what meals we had cooked, what time the lights went out in each room. My wife's name was written, my children's names, even my own, underlined in red ink, like the writer had been trying to understand us, categorize us, or perhaps anticipate what we'd do next. The police investigated thoroughly. They searched the property from top to bottom, brought in dogs to pick up a scent, combed the surrounding woods and neighboring yards, but in the end, they found nothing. No fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, no indication of how or when the intruder had first arrived or if he had already left. The earliest entry in the journal was dated 3 months before we moved in. But that didn't necessarily mean that's when it all began. He could have been there long before the house went up for foreclosure, maybe even before the previous owners had vacated. And the thought that he might have simply stayed behind, unnoticed by inspectors, realtors, or us, was almost more than I could handle. We didn't stay in the house another night. We packed what we could in a matter of hours and checked into a hotel across town, where my children asked quiet questions I didn't know how to answer. And my wife sat silently beside me, staring out the window with the kind of expression I hadn't seen on her face before that day, or since. We sold the house within the month, took a financial loss, and never looked back. To this day, I still find myself lying awake at night, not because I fear that man specifically, but because I now understand in a way I didn't before that the walls we rely on for safety are thinner than we think. And the sense of privacy we hold so dear is often just an illusion. I never heard him. I never saw him. And yet, he had been closer to us than anyone outside our family, listening, watching, recording. I don't know if he meant to hurt us. I don't know if he simply liked being close. What I do know is that there are things you can't unsee once you've discovered them. And no matter how far you move, or how strong your new locks are, that sense of being watched, that suspicion that something or someone might be living just out of sight, never really leaves you. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is this: we still don't know if he ever really left.